Hey, Bighara here with another installment of my video blog. It's a quick stealth recording while I'm here at work, just taking a break in one of the lounges. And it's going to continue my little installments about some of the classic D&D mechanics or tropes or whatever you want to call them. Today's going to talk about Vancian magic, named after Jack Vance, but basically the D&D-style of magic where you have spell slots, memorization, or prep ahead of time, fire and forget, whatever you want to call it. The typical argument that I hear is that, one, it's very limiting to low-level characters where they might have only maybe one spell a day or something like that. And then also the idea that you never know what's going to be the useful spell. And even if a class may have, 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 or more spells from a given level available, you kind of have to play the odds and say, well, for instance, the cleric would say, well, the odds are the one that I'm going to need or someone's going to need at some point is Cure Light Wounds at low levels, and therefore they're not going to bother with some of the other options they might have, even if those spells might be kind of cool or handy to use from time to time. I've been talking about that a little bit on my written blog about the random spell assessments and the idea of some of the lesser known, or not lesser known, but lesser used spells. This is true, and I do understand that point. I think that when you look at the D&D model for spell slots and memorization and so forth, when I say D&D, I mean more of the classic style of Dungeons & Dragons, not the later editions necessarily, as opposed to things like powers or having spell points or that sort of thing. It, one, ties into something I've talked about before with the idea of D&D being to a certain degree, a resource management kind of a game. And the idea that you have to look ahead, you have to think about it, and you have to, you have to decide, and that's part of the challenge. One of the other things that it points to is a certain flavor, I think, a genre or flavor or an archetype or whatever you want to call it of a spellcaster, and the idea of, in the case of something like a wizard, the more the bookish wizard that studies and has its book with whatever spells and adds to it as time goes by, and that factors in when you talk about things like their low hit points, their poor attack rolls, no armor. They're not supposed to be this really physical or dynamic guy. They're supposed to be more of an intellectual. And, that's a rationalization to a certain point, but I think it's true to a certain degree. It also ties into the idea, I don't want to talk about old school versus new school, but the idea of the less than escalated, heroic, epic level of power level, especially in a starting player character in those games, as opposed to possibly in some other games or other versions of D&D, where you're not supposed to be starting off. When you start off, you're not this superhero. You're not this amazing, incredible, extraordinary human being. You have potential, but you're just some guy with maybe, a little bit more training or a little bit of magic or maybe a little bit better equipment than some normal people, and you're trying to claw your way up the ladder. And that's, again, that kind of gets into a flavor or a genre, but I think that's sort of how a lot of people who enjoy the old school or older versions of the game view that kind of fantasy, as opposed to something where right out of the gate you're, just you're a ninja, or whatever, you're a master warrior or a super powerful sorcerer or whatever it is. That the idea is that you're not going to be heads and shoulders above the average Joe, at least at the beginning. Eventually you'll get to a point where you're pretty impressive, but you kind of earn your way up that ladder. So, and like so many of these things, it kind of depends on what you find fun, but instead of looking at the classic spell mechanics and saying, oh, it makes spellcasters too weak, You look at it in the longer term and you say, but eventually they get very powerful. And to tie back to something else about when I was thinking about with the clerics and the Cure Light Wounds, it also shifts the emphasis when you look at some of the other spells away from combat and more toward exploration, information, managing resources. So you have things like light spells and stuff like that. And the idea that magic is not artillery, that it can be. I mean, you know, spells like Fireball and Magic Missile, obviously there are combat-related spells as well as healing, but it's not only about that. And the fact that you have spells like Tensor's Floating Disc means something in a game where you're worrying about encumbrance. The idea that you have spells like Speak with Animals or Resist Cold, you know, or things like this. These are things where you're finding other things to do besides just how it deals with hit points or dealing out damage or recovering damage or things like that, or being less likely to take damage. And there are other things to use your magic for, and that you're going to start off with a relatively modest selection, both of spells to choose from and spells per day, and work your way up from there. So those are some of my thoughts about the classic spell mechanics, and that's all for now. Take it easy.